What if the most powerful voice in the church was no longer heard from a throne, but whispered from forgotten refugee camp? What if the heart of faith wasn't found behind marble walls, but in the dirt where a child asks, "Does God come late?" This is not a story about scandal or controversy. It's about a man who gave up power to find something greater, mercy, in its purest form. And when the world saw what he chose to do, everything began to change. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear just might reshape the way you see the church compassion and the place where love truly lives. Now let's journey into the unforgettable story. The first light of morning crept through the stained glass windows of the apostolic palace casting delicate shards of color across the marble floor. The air was still and reverent, as if even the wind dared not intrude upon this moment. Inside a solemn chamber high above St. Peter's Square, Pope Leo XIV sat alone, a modest cup of green tea steamed quietly at his side. Before him lay a thick red folder, its cover stamped in firm black letters, LGBTQ Pastoral Report. He had spent the entire night in prayer, pacing, kneeling, weeping, seeking not only the guidance of God, but the courage to act upon it. The folder did not merely contain words, it carried the soul of the church at a crossroads. He ran his fingers slowly over the cover, as though he might divine its truth by touch alone. It wasn't the paper that weighed heavily on his heart. It was the conflict, the division, the pain rising like a storm within the church he had vowed to shepherd. Just hours earlier, the Vatican had witnessed a thunderous clash between two of its most revered cardinals, Antonio Tagle and Robert Serra, both men devout and brilliant in their own right, stood on opposing sides of a wound, splitting the church how to care for the LGBTQ faithful. One spoke of mercy and inclusion, the other of doctrine, an order that had spoken not with cruelty, but with passion that brimmed with fear for the church's soul. The Holy Father had listened in silence that night, knowing the morning would demand more than silence. Now, with daylight filtering across ancient stone, the silence was breaking. Footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor beyond the chamber, a measured and ceremonial cadence. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that had sustained him for years. "Not my will, Lord, but yours." When the knock came, a single deliberate knock, it was not surprising. The Pope looked toward the door and spoke softly, "Enter." The door creaked open slowly, and walked Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, his cassock pristine, his face solemn. The sunlight caught the silver strands in his hair, but it was his eyes that spoke most deep pools of exhaustion, compassion, and something more ancient than either sorrow. The Pope gestured gently toward the chair opposite him. "Please, Louis, sit." Tagle nodded and settled into the chair with the grace of a man who had weathered many storms, his fingers loosely gripping the rosary that rested on his chest. For a moment, neither spoke. There was only the distant toll of a morning bell echoing from the basilica below, as if heaven itself held its breath. Finally, the Pope spoke. His voice was low, but steady, a current beneath still waters. "Last night's words cannot be undone." He paused. "I had hoped you and Robert might find a way to walk forward, together, united, even if not aligned. But it has become clear that path no longer exists." Tagle lowered his gaze, nodding almost imperceptibly. The Pope placed his hand deliberately on the red folder between them. "I have prayed for clarity, and the answer has been given." Another pause. "And then from this day forth, pastoral responsibility for LGBTQ ministry will be entrusted solely to Cardinal Serra." Silence fell, so thick it seemed to muffle the walls themselves. Tagle didn't flinch. He merely closed his eyes for a breath and opened them again with quiet sorrow. "Holy Father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "my only desire has ever been to serve with mercy, with compassion, and with love, nothing more." Pope Leo nodded slowly, his own eyes moistening. "I know, Louis, and I honor that heart. But the church is cracking. If we do nothing, those cracks will become collapsed." Tagle looked up, his hand moved to the crucifix that hung over his heart. "If mercy no longer has a place in the heart of the church, who will go searching for the abandoned child? Who will speak to the soul's cry in silence?" The Pope closed his eyes. The question lingered heavy and unanswerable. Maybe it wasn't meant for just one man, maybe. It was for every bishop, every priest, every soul in the church who had ever been torn between truth and tenderness. A knock broke the moment. The Holy Father didn't need to turn. "He's here," he said quietly. The door opened once more, and in stepped Cardinal Robert Serra. His posture was unyielding, his cassock red, with black trim crisp like his convictions. He bowed respectfully, though his eyes never met Tagle's. Instead, they locked on the red folder with a gaze as sharp as a blade. "Pope." Leo motioned toward the chairs. "Please, both of you sit." They obeyed. Three men bound by the same faith, seated around a single table with the weight of the church between them. The Pope placed his hand on the folder. "Once again, Robert, from this day forward, you will take full authority over the church's LGBTQ pastoral mission. You are to ensure all remains in order and in line with doctrine and cardinals, Sarah nodded. In this age of confusion, the church must offer clarity. Mercy is a virtue, but it cannot replace truth. Tagle's hands remained folded. His voice came soft but unwavering. And when wounded souls come to the church afraid, broken, and begging for belonging, do we first offer law, or do we wrap them in the cloak of God's mercy? Sarah didn't hesitate. We give them light, and light begins with truth. The Pope raised his hand. Enough. His voice was firm. This is not a battlefield. This is the heart of the church. He turned to Sarah. Robert the First entrust you with this responsibility, but do not let it become a sword. Then to Tagle, Louis, you are not being cast out. You are being sent elsewhere, back to the poor, back to the margins, to where your voice brings not division, but light. Tagle stood. He bowed his head. Then I will go, but I cannot be silent. I will keep bringing God's mercy to places where people believe. He has turned his back. He turned to leave, his footsteps quiet on the marble, and just before he reached the door, he stopped, glanced back, and said the words that would echo through the ages. If mercy no longer has a place at the center, perhaps the center has lost its heart. The door closed behind him, and silence fell. If today's message moved your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Pope Leo XIV and Faith. Join us on a journey of true spiritual awakening and divine insight. What are your thoughts on today's message? Leave a comment below. Your words might be the light someone else desperately needs. This isn't just a video. It's a call back to who we truly are. The Vatican halls had seen centuries of decisions, but few as heavy as the one that had just passed behind the chamber's sealed door. Outside, the air was cool, the sky painted in the hues of Roman morning, soft golds and smoky blues that blurred the horizon like ancient oil. But for Cardinal Luis Antonio, nothing felt gentle. The world, the palace, the church itself seemed to press down on his shoulders with a weight far beyond his cassock as he stepped away from the room where Pope Leo XV had made his declaration. His hands remained gently closed around the crucifix at his chest, not in defiance, but in surrender. He had not expected a different outcome. Somewhere deep in his heart, he had sensed this day would come. Only the echo of his footsteps filled the corridor. There were no guards, no aides, no one waiting. It was as if the very walls had been asked to bear witness in silence. Every icon he passed, Christ penetrated. The suffering Virgin, the holy martyrs, seemed to regard him not with pity, but with knowing compassion. He walked slowly, allowing each step to breathe the gravity of what had transpired behind him. Two cardinals remained in that room, one entrusted with power, the other kneeling in prayer. He found himself drawn not toward his quarters, but to the far end of the apostolic palace, to a small side chapel. Rarely used, a chapel held no grandeur, no elaborate mosaics. It was a place for simple priests, wooden pews worn kneelers, the faint scent of beeswax and stone. He opened the door without sound and stepped inside. The light from the single stained glass window bathed the altar in crimson and gold, reflecting on a humble icon of Madonna and Child. Tagle knelt slowly, removing his glasses, and let his forehead rest against clasped hands. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The walls of that place had heard every prayer he never uttered aloud. He sat in silence until the bells of St. Peter's tolled once more. Then, rising with quiet resolve, he exited the chapel and turned down a corridor that led not toward titles or thrones, but toward his modest room and a waiting suitcase. It sat neatly by the door, just as he had left it hours earlier, packed not with power, but with plain clothes, a small travel Bible, a journal, and a wooden rosary given to him by a refugee child years ago. He reached for the handle and paused, his gaze falling on a framed photograph nearby. It was a picture of him with a group of barefoot children in Manila, smiling unguarded, holy in their joy. He had always felt closest to Christ, not in Vatican chambers, but among the poor. That memory was not nostalgia. It was calling elsewhere in the palace. Pope Leo XIV sat again before the same folder that had defined the day. He stared at the red cover, but his mind drifted to the quiet weight in Tagle's eyes, to the way his voice did not rise in protest, but fell like a tear. The Pope leaned back, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He had hoped for peace, unity, but perhaps peace did not come from compromise on from conviction. And today conviction had demanded a cost. He wondered, not for the first time, whether obedience to God always meant breaking hearts. In another wing, Cardinal Robert Sarah was being briefed by aides. Their voices were efficient, their words precise, outlining transition authority, the new directives, the expectations for doctrinal clarity. But Robert said little. His mind remained on Tagle's final words. If mercy no longer has a place at the center, perhaps the center has lost its heart. He dismissed the thought quickly. Mercy was not absent, he told himself. It was simply being returned to its proper place beneath the law, not above it. But deep inside, a shadow stirred as the sun rose higher. Tagle made his way toward the eastern gate of the Vatican. No procession accompanied him, no ceremony, no fanfare. He walked alone, his cassock catching the wind. Like the edge of a prayer about to be spoken, he stopped briefly at the statue of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, weathered and serene. Nestled within a small alcove, he reached out and touched the hem of the statue's robe. "Mother," he whispered, "walk with me now." Then he stepped out to the side gate into the streets of Rome, unnoticed by the world, but accompanied by a heaven that never turns away from a faithful. His driver was already waiting a nondescript car with no crest or flag. Tagle climbed in without a word, and the vehicle pulled away from the Vatican's mighty walls for the first time in years. He felt no chains of protocol, no weight of office, only the quiet certainty that he was going where Christ had once walked among the forgotten. The car headed toward the airport, his next destination, a refugee camp on the outskirts of an unnamed region torn by war and hunger, where no reporter stood and no cardinals led masses. He had visited it once before, years ago, when few in the Vatican knew or cared. This time he would return not as a leader of doctrine, but as a servant of mercy, and for him that was enough. As the car disappeared into the Roman morning, the bells of the basilica chimed again, echoing over rooftops and alleys and down the narrow streets. People heard the sound and went about their day, unaware of what had just shifted in the soul of the church. And inside the chapel where Tagle had prayed, the sun fell upon the icon once more. But now the light was softer, more diffused, almost like a blessed Madonna seemed to smile ever so faintly, as if she too had watched the meeting no one wanted and wept that today's message moved your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to Pope Leo XIV and Faith. Join us on a journey of true spiritual awakening and divine insight. What are your thoughts on today's message? Leave a comment below. Your words might be the light someone else desperately needs. This isn't just a video, it's a call back to who we truly are. Rome shimmered beneath the night sky, the domes and spires of the eternal city outlined in silver as the lights of the Vatican dimmed one by one. But within the quiet corridors of the Apostolic Palace, one door clicked shut without ceremony. Cardinal Louis Antonio Tagle stepped into the evening air, his cassock gently swaying with the breeze, the crucifix at his chest glinting briefly under the lamppost, as if it too were taking one last look at the walls that had defined his public life. There were no trumpets, no footmen, no chance of farewell, just a single suitcase rolling behind him on marble floors, and the echo of his own footsteps following close like a shadow. He paused at the east gate, just beneath the statue of St. Peter with keys in hand, and glanced back once the Vatican rose. Behind him, majestic, immovable, and yet tonight it seemed smaller, quieter, as though it were holding its breath. The ancient stones bore no judgment, only the weight of too many goodbyes never spoken aloud in the stillness. He lifted his rosary, gently, fingers brushing each bead, whispering a prayer not for himself, but for those he was about to meet. Then he stepped out of the gate and into the night, not as a prince of the church, but as a pilgrim of sorrow. The car that awaited him was plain, nondescript. Its windows modestly tinted, its driver silent. Tagle nodded as he entered the back seat, placing the suitcase beside him and settling into the leather that creaked under the long hours ahead. He looked out the window as the car began its descent through the narrow Roman streets, cafes, where closing lovers strolled beneath glowing lanterns, and somewhere distant the bells of the convent softly rang the hour. No one on the sidewalks knew that a cardinal of the church was passing them by. No one stopped. And that for the first time in many years felt right. Tagle closed his eyes as the car made its way toward the airport. He did not sleep, had left him a night before along with the illusions of permanence. Instead, he let his thoughts drift to the places where God had once whispered most clearly to him, not in conference rooms or papal chambers, but in back alleyways in Manila, in flooded slums where children clung to scraps of wood in prison cells, where gang members wept as they recited the Hail Mary. He remembered a night long ago, kneeling beside the body of a street vendor's daughter, her tiny hands, cold, her lungs collapsed from malnutrition. He remembered holding her mother, who had no words left, only sobs and snot and silence. And he remembered in that moment, not doctrine, not canon law, but the sheer weight of human sorrow. That was the first time he had felt Christ's heartbreak within his own chest. The airport was empty, its halls illuminated by fluorescent light, its benches lined with travelers draped in sweaters, scarves, and exhaustion. No one looked up as the cardinal walked through security. No one noticed the absence of red silk or the missing ring. He had left all that behind. What remained was a man, tired, humble, deeply awake. He boarded the plane, without ceremony, found a seat by the window, and gazed out at the tarmac, bathed in halogen light. Somewhere far from this place was a camp where names had been forgotten and hope was sold cheaper than bread. That was where he was going. No title announced him, no itinerary was made public. His heart led him. Nothing more hours past the jet engines hummed through clouds, and the darkness outside stretched endlessly. Yet within that metal vessel something sacred stirred. Tagle pulled out his journal and began to write, not for the church, not for history, but for the child who would one day ask him why he stayed faithful. His pen moved slowly across the page. If God walks among the poor, then every step toward him is a step toward him. When the plane landed, it was dawn again, but a harsher one, dry, cracked, and rusted by sand. The refugee camp sprawled across the desert, like a wound rows of canvas tents torn by wind. In time, the air smelled of sweat ash, and something deeper grief. A volunteer in a dusty vest greeted him, unsure at first at the man in simple clothing was truly who they had been told to expect. Tagle nodded quietly, offering no formalities. Let's begin, he said. They moved through the camp. Quickly, children chased each other. Barefoot women stirred boiling pots over open fires, and old men coughed behind strips of torn cloth meant to keep the sun out everywhere. He looked. Tagle saw not despair but resilience, and that in itself was holy. He stopped beside a small child no older than 5, who sat alone, his knees scraped, and bleeding. The boy looked up with wide eyes, unsure whether to run or trust. Tagle knelt beside him. Without a word, pulled a clean cloth from his pocket, and gently cleaned the wound. The boy winced, then leaned closer, resting his forehead lightly against the cardinal's arm. A moment passed in silence. Then in a voice so small it could have been mistaken for wind, the child asked, "Father, does God come late?" The words hit Tagle like thunder. He did not answer right away. He could not. Instead, he looked into the boy's face, touched his shoulder, and whispered, "No, child is already here." As the sun climbed higher, Tagle helped distribute bread, carried buckets of water, bandaged small wounds, and blessed the dying. No one asked for sermons, no one mentioned his title. He was simply one more pair of hands, one more heart. Still beating at noon, a Syrian mother approached him, clutching a baby with sunken eyes and cracked lips. She didn't speak English, only wept into his shoulder. As he held the child, he prayed over the infant, not loudly, but with trembling breath, asking God to be near. And somewhere deep inside, he felt that God was near, not in the marble of basilicas or the grandeur cathedrals, but in that moment, in tears and sweat and wounds. As the day wore on, a volunteer captured a brief video clip. Just few minutes. Tagle, wiping blood from a child's knee, a mother weeping in his arms. Scripture whispered beneath a ragged tent. No one knew. That clip would soon shake the world. The sun climbed high over the horizon, merciless and white, baking the canvas tents and cracked earth of the refugee camp. Dust clung to the hems of Cardinal Tagle's cassock as he moved from tent to tent, offering more than aid, offering presence. He had shed the titles, the grandeur, the weight of ecclesial power, and what remained was a man walking with the forgotten, listening to the wounded, and kneeling beside the broken. His name was not whispered with reverence. Here the children called him Father. Louise, the older women, simply smiled and gestured for him too. So there was no red hat, no ring, no entourage. Just a rosary in his pocket and calloused hands that no longer trembled when touching suffering. The morning had already brought tears. A woman no older than 30 had clutched his sleeve and pleaded in broken English for help finding her son. He had wandered into the outer zones of the camp 2 days ago and never returned. Her voice cracked with exhaustion, her hands shaking as she pressed a photograph into his palm. The boy was maybe 9. Tagle promised to ask around, and for the next 2 hours he moved from tent to tent, asking in soft Arabic learned long ago in seminary training. If anyone had seen him, the answers were all the same: sorry, no, may God help you. At one point, an old man laid a hand on Tagle's shoulder and said, "God sees, even when we do not." It was a truth the cardinal clung to in silence. By noon, the heat was suffocating. The medical tent swelled with coughing children and elderly men whose lungs were failing from sand and smoke. Tagle did not hesitate. He rolled up his sleeves, helped fill buckets with clean water, and tore strips of cloth to clean minor wounds. He prayed over each patient, not as a performance, but as instinct, as breath. One nurse, a young woman from Madrid, paused to watch him, a puzzled look on her face. Later, she asked him quietly, "You're really a cardinal, aren't you?" He smiled gently and answered, "I used to be called that, now I just serve." What struck the camp most was not his status, but his stillness. Tagle never rushed. He listened. He looked people in the eyes. He touched their wounds with reverence for those who had spent months, even years, being processed, displaced, and ignored. His gaze felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. It was the look of someone who had not come to fix them, but to be with them, and that perhaps was holier than healing. Later, in the afternoon, under the slanted shade of a sagging tarp, Tagle gathered A group of children, they sat in a semicircle around him, cross-legged in the dirt, eyes wide with curiosity. He pulled out a small weather Bible and opened to the story of the Good Samaritan. He didn't read it like a sermon. He told it like a bedtime story, his voice rising and falling with gentle rhythm. The children listened, some understanding the words, others just soaking in the kindness behind them. When he reached the part where the Samaritan lifts the wounded man onto his donkey, Tagle paused, looked around at the bruised knees, the bandaged arms, the children clutching each other's hands, and asked softly, "Who do you think God loves more, the priest who walks past or the one who stops and kneels?" A small boy in the back raised his hand timidly. "The one who kneels," he said. Tagle smiled. "Yes." He said the one who kneels. In that moment, a volunteer captured a few seconds of footage. The U camera didn't pan dramatically. It just held steady on the image of a cardinal in dusty clothes, surrounded by children reading scripture, with a voice full of tears and tenderness. Behind in the camp stirred mothers cooking over fires, teens patching tents, elders resting in folding chairs. Life continued, but something sacred hovered there. It was as if heaven had leaned in just a little closer. That night the clip would begin its journey. They volunteered without ceremony or approval, uploaded it to a modest YouTube channel used for sharing updates about humanitarian efforts. The caption was simple: a priest reading the gospel in the middle of a refugee camp. No mention of titles, no Vatican connections. The video lasted 5 minutes and 20 seconds, but something about it, something unspeakably pure, pierced through the noise of the digital world. Within an hour, 100 views, and 1,000, then 10,000 by the time the moon rose over the camp, and Tagle knelt once more in quiet prayer beside a small makeshift altar made from which scraps. The video had passed 100,000 views, and climbing elsewhere on the other side of the world, a young theology student in Lima watched the clip and wept. In Paris, a retired nun paused her dinner to replay it 3 times. In New York, a reporter working on a piece about Vatican politics stumbled across it, paused, and whispered, "Wait, that's Tagle." The name spread in quiet awe. It was not just what he said, it was how he said it. It was the way his voice cracked when the children asked if God still loved them. It was the way he touched their foreheads, as if anointing saints. Back in the camp, Tiger was unaware of the waves swelling behind him. He sat beneath the stars at night, writing in his journal, "Mercy." He wrote, "is not a doctrine to be debated. It is a fire to be carried." He looked up at the sky, filled with constellations few had ever named, and let his eyes rest on a single star blinking faintly above the tents. "Lord," he whispered, "if I am forgotten by the world, let me be remembered by the least of these." A soft rustling behind him drew his attention. It was the same small boy from earlier, the one who had asked if God arrived late. He handed Tagle a torn scrap of paper. On it, crudely drawn in pencil, was a heart with a cross in the center. No words, just that. Tagle looked at the child, his eyes misting this. He said softly, "is more beautiful than all the frescoes in the Vatican." The boy beamed. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the smile. And far away in a silent office in the Vatican, a flickering notification lit up a simple laptop screen. The world was beginning to watch. The stars still hung over the refugee camp like flickering witnesses when the video crossed the threshold. No one could have predicted, in the early hours of morning, while most of the camp slept or stirred quietly under threadbare blankets, a tiny corner of the internet began to buzz. Someone had shared a 5-minute clip to a Facebook group dedicated to Catholic humanitarian work. A pastor in the Midwest reposted it with short caption, "This is what the gospel looks like." Within minutes, it had been shared again and again by Dawn in Europe. It had reached Catholic forums and Rome Youth Ministry pages in Brazil, and even faith groups in the Philippines who recognized the voice and face of the man in the video, though now blurred with dust and humility. At first, no one could believe it. The man reading scripture to refugee children, wiping blood from a boy's leg, hugging a mother as she cried into his shoulder. Was that really Cardinal Tagle? Could a prince of the church have laid aside his robes and power and disappeared into the margins with nothing but a Bible and open hands? And more importantly, why the mystery only deepened the hunger to watch. People didn't just view the clip, they lingered in it. They rewound the part where the child asked, "Does God come late?" They cried when Tagle answered, "He's already here." They paused and whispered prayers as he touched the cross around his neck with trembling fingers. It was no longer a video. It had become a mirror, and across continents, people began to see their own hearts in the dust on his cassock and the tears in his voice. By mid-morning, the video had reached 1 million views in Manila. The cathedral's bells rang at noon. As a crowd gathered beneath the spires, a large screen had been hastily installed in the plaza. and the clip played on loop elderly women holding rosaries clutched tissues to their faces. Young men bowed their heads, some weeping openly. The Archbishop of Manila, once quietly distant from Tagle's methods, watched the footage from a corner pew and whispered, "I see now in Paris strangers on a metro pause their scrolling and turn their phones toward one another. Have you seen this?" They asked this man. He was silenced. And look where he is now. In New York news anchors interrupted regular programming to broadcast a segment titled The Cardinal. Among the forgotten, they replayed the footage and cut to studio commentary filled not with scandal or debate, but stunned reverence. But in Rome, the reaction was different. Within the cool halls of the Vatican, the video was met first with disbelief, then with confusion, and finally with a quiet, rising sense of unease. Clergy and administrators exchanged glances over breakfast. Some whispered prayers, others looked away, and one man, Cardinal Robert Sarah, sat in silence in his private quarters, his face unreadable as the video played on his screen. He watched the entire thing, every second, from the first word of scripture to the final image of Tagle embracing the child who had drawn the heart with the cross. Sarah did not blink, but his hand resting on the chair's armrest slowly tightened into a fist. Behind him, an aide stepped forward, hesitating. "Your Eminence," he said softly, "social media is calling you the man who opposed mercy." The silence in the room was thick. Cardinal Sarah said nothing. He reached slowly into his inner pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a letter he had begun drafting the night before. It was a declaration, a strong theological defense of doctrine, a warning against the risks of emotional manipulation and sentimental mercy. He read it over once more, but something in him stalled. Not doubt, not guilt, but gravity, the weight of a church. Shifting beneath him elsewhere, in a quieter corner of the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo IV sat in his private study. The doors closed, the windows shuttered against the glare of the Roman sun. Before him, a simple wooden laptop glowed. Faintly, the screen paused on the image of Tagle, kneeling in the dirt surrounded by children. The Pope's hand trembled slightly as he reached forward and pressed play again. This time, he did not watch as a leader evaluating a former subordinate. He watched as a priest who had once walked barefoot through the hills of Peru, who had knelt beside dying miners and held the hands of abandoned mothers. He watched as a man who remembered what it meant to serve before it meant to govern. When Tagle's voice whispered the words, "Mercy is not a doctrine to be argued, it's a fire to be carried." Pope Leo leaned back in his chair, his eyes stinging. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was faded with time of black, and white image of his younger self standing barefoot in a dusty village, square surrounded by children, not unlike those in the camp. He had once believed so fully that love could change the world. Somewhere along the way, bureaucracy had dulled that fire. But Tagle had rekindled something. The Pope stood across the room and placed the photo beside a wooden crucifix on his private altar. Then, with quiet care, he added a dried olive branch, a gift he'd once ed during a peace mission in Jerusalem. He stared at the altar for a long moment, then whispered, "Perhaps it's time the church remembers how to cry again." Outside, the palace crowds had begun gathering in Street Peter Square, not in protest, not in anger, but in prayer. Word had spread that the Vatican was reviewing the video. People from across Italy had taken trains and buses holding signs that read, "Lead with love and the gospel in action." They didn't shout. They simply knelt one by one, filling the square with silence more powerful than thunder. Back in the refugee camp, Tagle remained unaware of the world's response. He was in the medical tent, cradling a child with fever. The boy stirred and murmured something in his native tongue. Tagle didn't understand the words, but he kissed the boy's forehead and whispered, "You're safe now." The volunteer who had posted the original clip returned to him and said softly, "Father Louise, your video, it's everywhere. Millions have seen it." Tagle looked up confused. "What video?" She showed him the screen, his face dusty and worn, reading scripture to children. He blinked slowly. "I was only doing what I came to do," she smiled. "And the world is watching." Tagle turned away, his heart suddenly heavy, not with pride, but with all that may they see him, not me. And with that, he picked up a basin of water and walked back into the camp, not to be seen, but to serve. If today's message moved your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Pope Leo XIV. And faith, join us on a journey of truth, spiritual awakening, and divine insight. What are your thoughts on today's message? Leave a comment below. Your words might be the light someone else desperately needs. This isn't just a video. It's a call back to who we truly are. The halls of the Vatican, once bustling with quiet footsteps and murmured Latin prayers, had fallen into an unusual hush. The typical rhythm of ecclesial life had paused. Conversations where softer papers were shuffled more slowly. The priests and staff who passed each other in The corridors now nodded with gravity that did not need words they had all seen at the Ido. It had made his way not only across continents, but deep into the heart of this ancient citadel of doctrine, and no one quite knew how to respond. In one corner of the apostolic palace, a secretary whispered into the ear of a bishop who had formerly opposed Cardinal Tagle's methods. The bishop said nothing, only lowered his gaze to his. Coffee, which had long gone cold, in another room, a young priest fresh from seminary replayed the clip on his tablet and quietly wept, hiding behind a column as his hands trembled. Some had turned their faces away in discomfort. Others had turned their hearts towards something they didn't yet understand, a stirring they hadn't felt since ordination. Behind a thick wooden door lined with red velvet, Pope Leo XIV sat once more before his private altar, the photo of young Tagle printed from a viral video was now framed and placed beside the dried olive branch. The Pope had not called any meetings that morning. He had not answered the reports piling up on his desk. He simply sat, his fingers running slowly over his rosary, his lips barely moving in prayer. His eyes were swollen with lack of sleep, and within them was a depth of sorrow that no one else had seen since the night he was elected Supreme Pontiff. He whispered aloud, not to his aides or even to the room, but to the small wooden crucifix beside him, "Lord, did I protect your church from breaking, or did I just break your heart?" His voice cracked on the final word. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, as if heaven itself was holding its breath. A knock sounded softly at the door. The Pope didn't answer. The knock came again, firmer this time, slowly. He walked across the room, and opened it. Standing there was Monsieur, just one of his most trusted aides, holding a printed transcript. "Your Holiness," he said gently, "we've received requests from bishops, priests, even heads of state. They're asking for a response." The Pope took the paper in his hands, but didn't read it right away. Instead, he looked out the window over the courtyard where tourists usually gathered. "Today it was still, I know what they're asking," he murmured. "They want to decide if mercy is a movement or a mistake." Joseph shifted uneasily. "The people are watching, and the clergy are listening. Whatever you say now, Holy Father, will echo." The Pope nodded slowly. "Then I must echo Christ." Elsewhere in the Vatican, Cardinal Robert Serra stood at his own window, watching the clouds drift across a Roman sky. His copy of the video transcript lay face down on his desk. The words were familiar. He had watched them unfold in real time, and yet reading them in print made them sharper. Harder, the lines that once seemed pastoral now felt pointed. He picked up the letter he had been drafting. His formal doctrinal response to the viral moment. It defended orthodoxy, emphasized tradition, and warned against what he described as emotional populism. But his hand hovered above the signature line. The aide who had whispered about his social media, nicknamed the man who opposed mercy, now stood quietly by the door. "Eminence," he said, "you've always spoken clearly, but the world is hearing something else." Serra turned, not angrily, but slowly. "And what do you hear?" The aide hesitated, then replied with honesty, "I hear a man kneeling beside the wounded. I hear the gospel with dirt under its fingernails." The cardinal looked at him for a long moment, then set the pen down. He didn't tear up the letter. He didn't revise it. He simply left it in sign outside the Vatican. The scene had begun to shift in the streets of Rome. Pilgrims and locals alike had gathered quietly in front of screens, cafes, played the video on loop. Tourists who had once rushed toward the basilica with cameras now lingered in silence, some lighting candles, others simply sitting on the steps of old churches with bowed heads. The press had grown bolder. Questions were sent in from major networks. Was Cardinal Tagle's removal a mistake? Would the Pope reinstate him? What did this mean for the Church's future relationship with marginalized communities? But the Vatican offered no official comment, and that silence said more than words could. Within the refugee camp, Tagle remained untouched by the media frenzy. He had no smartphone, no television, no social media. He spent his days in the dust and his nights in prayer. When the camp director approached him and said, "The world is watching you," he smiled kindly and said, "Then may they see the poor." On the 6th evening since his arrival, he stood beneath a flickering oil lamp reading scripture to a group of children and volunteers. He didn't reference politics or bishops or decisions. He spoke only of the prodigal son of the father who ran to the robe to ring the feast. When he reached the part where the father embraces the wayward child, his voice caught, not because of the theology, but because he believed it with all his soul. Mercy runs. Mercy embraces, mercy restores. That night, a still frame from the video, Tagle holding a refugee child, both of them looking toward heaven, was printed on the front page of several major newspapers. It was captioned with 5 simple words, "The Church still has a heart." And in his private chapel, Pope Leo XIV lit a candle not for clarity, but for courage. He placed it before the crucifix and knelt again, this time not in doubt, but in longing. "Let your heart be ours again," he whispered. "Let your tears be our gospel." The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, and in the quiet he felt it, not an answer, not a sign, but a presence, the same presence that had once stirred in the stable in Bethlehem, the same presence that had wept at Lazarus' tomb, the same presence now kneeling in a refugee camp, dusty and unnoticed perhaps. That was a voice the world needed to hear, not thunder, not decree, just mercy. The final day of the Vatican Conference dawned. Under a sky stre, with the first light of a hopeful, mourning cardinals from around the world had assembled in the grand hall of sin, dressed in their formal reds, each carrying documents, notes, and decades of theology etched into their posh mood. In the room was one of tension, veiled in routine, cordial greetings, practiced smiles, whispered exchanges about doctrine and authority. Yet beneath it all pulsed a silent anticipation. Something had shifted, no one could quite name it, but they all felt it. The viral video had become more than a curiosity. It had become a mirror, and today that mirror was about to be held up to the face of the church itself. A hush fell over the room as the schedule was distributed. The final speaker was listed with no fanfare, no title, no commentary. It simply read, "Representative of the Peripheries, Luis Antonio Tagle, Philippines, 5 minutes." Some raised their eyebrows, others exchanged looks, a few scoffed. What could he possibly say in 5 minutes? One cardinal murmured, another leaned over and whispered, "He already said everything," without saying a word. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the introductions began. The moderator spoke in firm, measured tones, summarizing the proceedings of the past week, debates on doctrine, decisions about pastor initiatives, formal announcements of new commissions. But it was all background noise to the moment. Everyone's sense was coming to room, quieted as the final name was called. Luis Antonio Tagle appeared on screen, broadcast live from the refugee camp, his image flickering with soft distortion from the unstable connection. He sat on a wooden chair beneath a canvas tent. Behind him, a blurred crowd of children playing with sticks and empty cans. He wore no formal robes, only a plain gray shirt and a simple wooden cross around his neck. The contrast with the velvet and marble of the sin hall was staggering. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked into the camera, his eyes tired but focused, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. Then in a voice quiet yet unwavering, he began, "When I arrived at this refugee camp, a boy approached me. He said he had a bandaged leg and a piece of paper in his hand. He asked me, 'Father, does God come late?' I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to tell him, 'God never comes late.' But I looked around at the dust, the hunger, the fear, and I couldn't say it not." Then the chamber fell completely silent. No cameras, shutters, no fingers typing on laptops, just stillness. Tagle continued, his voice growing steadier. "But over the past week, I have seen things. I have forgotten children who laugh with empty stomachs, mothers who hold their babies like sacred relics, men who carry water for hours just to keep others alive. And I realize something. God doesn't come late. We do, we the church, we arrive too late for the wounded, for the cast out, for the forgotten. We argue over language and law while people bleed in silence." He looked away from the camera for a moment, his breath catching. Then he turned back, his voice now edged with urgency. "I don't need a title to speak love. I don't need permission to wipe away tears. The only question that matters is this: if Jesus were alive today, where would he choose to sit, on a throne of gold or beside a mother in a refugee camp holding her dying child?" A few gasps broke the silence in the hall. One cardinal quietly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Another folded his hands and lowered his head. Tagle's gaze held steady. "I was removed from office, and that is fine. Power is not where the church lives. Mercy is. And if mercy no longer has a place at our center, then perhaps the center must move." He paused and offered a gentle smile. "Thank you for 5 minutes. It is more than enough to remind the church of who she truly is." The screen went black. The silence that followed was deeper than anything the sin had experienced. It wasn't awkward, wasn't even reverent. It was something else entirely. It was a silence of conviction, of hearts that had been pierced, and not by rhetoric, but by truth wrapped in tenderness. No one moved for a full minute. Then slowly an elderly bishop from Argentina stood and began to clap. The sound was soft, at first hesitant, but one by one others joined. Within moments, the chamber that had for years debated the place of mercy rose to its feet in applause for the man who had lost everything and gained something far greater. Voice that could no longer be silenced. In a small room far from the sin, Pope Leo XIV watched alone. His eyes were full, his expression unreadable. As the applause continued, he reached for a candle and lit it at his private altar. Then he bent his knee and prayed aloud. He said, Blessed are the merciful, help us remember why. Outside the Vatican, news of the speech spread faster than any official document. The video was replayed on every major network, translated into multiple languages, quoted on the floors of Parliament chambers, and read aloud in humble chapels. But it wasn't the virality that mattered. It was the substance. For the first time in a long time, the Church had not spoken down to the world. She had knelt beside it, and in that 5-minute window, the world knelt back the echo of Cardinal Tagle's 5-minute speech. Still lingered in the walls of churches and the halls of governments. Long after the screen had gone dark, it rippled outward like a stone tossed into still water, reaching places far beyond the Vatican. In homes and parishes and refugee centers and rural chapels, something began to stir a collective examination, not of doctrine or policy, but of conscience. In Paris, a group of theology students gathered in a quiet corner of their university chapel. They watched the video again, this time not with the aim to analyze or dissect, but simply to listen. One student, normally quiet in class, stood and said through tears that's the kind of priest I want to be. In Lima, a young seminarian knelt alone at the altar of his parish, whispering a prayer he couldn't have put into words a day before. Across the Atlantic, a cathedral in Manhattan dimmed its lights. For a vigil, the faithful sat in silence, watching the video projected against the stone walls, the words of mercy flickering like candlelight against the ancient masonry. But the change wasn't just among the people. Within the hierarchy of the Church itself, the effects were beginning to show. Letters arrived at the Vatican, not a few, but hundreds. Some were handwritten, others typed, many sent by email or courier. They came from bishops, from priests, from religious brothers and sisters who had once watched Cardinal Tagle from a distance, wary of his gentle tone, his unwavering commitment to the marginalized. These letters, one after another, did not defend policies or argue theology. They offer apologies not only to Tagle, but to what he represented, the part of the Church they had ignored or feared. The beating heart of mercy, some letters said, I had forgotten what compassion looked like. Others admitted, I was wrong to call mercy weakness. A cardinal who had spoken against Hegel during a previous sin wrote, I once believed that love without law was chaos. Now I see that law without love is cruelty. These messages, were not public. They were not read aloud in the square, but they reached the desks of those who mattered, and one by one hearts began to soften, not all, not suddenly, but undeniably. In the Philippines, news of the speech spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside churches, holding radio cell phones and small homemade banners. Some bore Table's name, others simply read, Salamat pa Cardinal Nangua, thank you, Cardinal of Mercy. One woman who had not been to Mass in a decade stood in front of the cathedral with tears on her cheeks and whispered, Now I remember why I believed. The speech became more than a moment. It became a movement, but Tagle himself remained untouched by the noise and the refugee camp life, moved forward in rhythm with need, not applause. He still rose early to help carry supplies, still knelt beside the sick, still read scripture beneath the tattered shade of the canvas tent. He had not changed, only the world's eyes had. One afternoon, while helping distribute food packs to a new group of arrivals, a young man approached him with cautious steps. He looked no older than 20, his eyes sunk in his hands, rough from work and hardship. He held something in his hand, a folded piece of newspaper with Tagle's face on it. You're him. The young man said in halting English, You're the one from the video. Tagle offered a soft smile. I'm just a priest, he said gently, taking the boy's hand. The young man shook his head. You talked about God and not just rules. My sister saw it. She prayed again. For the first time in years, there was a silence between them, not awkward but holy. Then the boy added, Thank you for coming here. No one comes here. Tagle knelt slightly to meet the young man's eyes. That's why I had to, he said, because this is where God already is. That night, a photo taken by a relief worker showed Tagle sitting beside a sick man under a lantern's flickering glow, his hand resting gently on the man's chest. There was nothing posed about it. No cameras had been expected, but the image somehow found its way to the internet. And within hours it had become another symbol, this time not controversy, but presence. The caption someone added read simply, He came back to where Jesus never left. Even the secular world began to pay attention in new ways. Editorials were published in major newspapers with titles like The Priest Who Reminded the Church of Christ and Mercy. The margins, news commentators, often cynical about religion, spoke with unexpected warmth. We've seen speeches before, one anchor said on a global network, but we don't often see hearts that speak louder than words. That's what we saw in that camp. And while praise echoed across continents, one figure remained largely silent. Cardinal Robert Sarah had not issued any public statement since Tagle's address in private. His staff noticed a shift. He was quieter, less certain, slower to offer strong rebukes. In meetings, the letter he had begun to draft remained unfinished, in his drawer gathering dust beneath newer folders filled with questions rather than declarations. He had watched the speech again twice in the solitude of his study, not with anger, but with unease. Something in Tagle's words clung to him like a question he had no answer for in the Apostolic Palace. Pope Leo XIV prepared to meet with several cardinals behind closed doors. But before the meeting began, he paused in the chapel, knelt before the crucifix, and whispered prayer not control, but surrender. Let your mercy be the measure, Lord, not our pride. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to ring, not for any ceremony, but simply because it was the hour. Yet today those bells rang with a different kind of weight. Across the square, people paused to listen. Tourists stopped walking, nuns closed their eyes, pilgrims held hands. No one could explain it, but somehow the air itself seemed filled with something sacred. And in a refugee camp far away, a man sat quietly beside a dying child, whispering psalms as her mother wept. There were no cameras there, no headlines, no applause, only mercy. The room was dim lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp and the flickering light of a candle burning steadily. On the windowsill, Cardinal Robert Sarah sat alone in his study, his chair unmoving. The pages of Tagle's speech transcript spread out in front of him. The words stared back at him with unrelenting clarity, so simple yet so piercing. He had read them more times than he would admit. Every line seemed to hum with a strange tension of voice, not rebellion, but of something harder to define. It wasn't disobedience that challenged him. It was love of love, so raw, so unconcerned with protocol that it threatened to unseat the comforts of certainty. For years, Sarah had built his life around conviction. Order was the compass by which he had navigated chaos, and doctrine was the foundation on which he had stood while the world tilted with moral confusion. But now something had shifted, not in the church yet, but in him. He hadn't told anyone, not even his closest aides, that the unfinished letter still rested in the top drawer of his desk. It had once been a declaration, carefully constructed and resolute, a defense of orthodoxy, a reminder that doctrine was the lifeblood of the church, not emotionalism. But each time he reached for the pen, he paused. Something stayed his hand, not doubt, not weakness. Something else. His fingers hovered over the drawer now. He opened it slowly and pulled out the parchment, his name already typed beneath the text. Waiting only for his signature, he read the final paragraph aloud, his voice steady but empty. Let us not be swayed by sentiment or spectacle, but remain rooted in the unchanging truth of the church. He stared at the words and whispered, and what if that truth has a pulse? He rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the Vatican gardens were still bathed in moonlight. He watched as a breeze stirred the olive trees. Mercy, he had always believed, was the fruit of truth, not its rival. But now he wondered, could mercy also be the soil in which truth grows? A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His aide entered hesitantly. Eminence, the press has requested a response. The world is watching. The other cardinals, some are waiting to see what you'll say. Sarah turned, his face unreadable. What would they have me say? That mercy is weakness, that service is insubordination. The aide lowered his eyes. They want clarity, clarity, Sarah repeated, walking back to the desk. And if clarity costs us compassion, if it silences the gospel in the name of preserving its sound. The aide didn't answer. He simply stepped back and let the silence return. Sarah placed the letter back in the drawer and closed it in another part of the Vatican. Pope Leo XIV sat with a photo in his hands, Tagle embracing the Syrian mother, the child wrapped in her arms. The Pope hadn't moved for some time. He had been staring at the image, tracing the expressions on their faces with his eyes, as if searching for a message encoded in their sorrow. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was the child's hand clutching the sleeve of Tagle's shirt. He turned toward his private altar and placed the photograph beside the wooden crucifix. There was no liturgy, no incense, just a simple gesture of reverence. Then he reached for the olive branch that had begun to dry and curl with age. It crumbled slightly in his hand. He thought of the letters, so many of them, each one echoing the same, "Please don't let mercy be silenced. Don't let the center grow cold." He looked up at the crucifix. Does a heart still beat? He asked softly, "Not mine, Lord, yours." Outside, the world moved in ways that no one could have predicted. Young people returned to confession after years away. Priests who had struggled with burnout began leading evening prayers with newfound tenderness. Parishioners who had once argued over church policies now held hands in silence before Mass. And in cities and villages where churches had long emptied, candles began to appear on steps lit by strangers in honor of the forgotten, the marginalized, and the man who had dared to sit among them. But it was not all awakening. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some voices rose in protest, accusing Tagle of emotional manipulation, of turning suffering into theater, of weakening the church's spine with tearful spectacles editorials were published with titles like The Danger of Soft Shepherds and Doctrine or Disintegration, but the critiques aloud, as they began to feel strangely hollow for each word of warning. There were 100 acts of compassion, inspired by what Tagle had done in the refugee camp. Tagle remained unaware of most of it. He hadn't asked to be followed, or defended he hadn't. Asked for attention. He continued his quiet rhythm, bathing wounds. Reading scripture kneeling beside dying children one evening as he handed out water with a group of volunteers, a young woman from Denmark approached him. "Cardinal," she said awkwardly. "I'm sorry, should I call you something else?" He smiled. "Call me whatever helps you remember. I'm your brother." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I stopped believing years ago, but when I saw your video, I started to pray again, just a little, just enough." He looked at her gently and said, "Sometimes a little is all heaven needs." That night the moon rose full over the camp. The children were asleep, curled together like birds in a nest of warm blankets. And Faded Hope Tagle sat at the edge of the camp with his journal. He wrote slowly, carefully, each word chosen. Like a prayer the world demands, titles heaven asks, for tears the church debates, power the gospel offers presence. I once thought I was sent away, now I know I was sent deeper inward, downward into the heart of Christ as. He closed the journal and looked at the stars. A breeze swept through the camp. It stirred the tents. It carried laughter from a distance. Fire, and for a moment closed his eyes and simply breathed, not as a cardinal, not as a symbol, just as a man who had found the church's heart still beating in places of the world, had forgotten the sun, had barely broken over the horizon when the sound of quiet singing drifted to the canvas corridors of the refugee camp. It wasn't rehearsed or polished, just a few mothers humming a hymn in their native tongue, their voices rising like incense with the smoke of breakfast fires. Cardinal Tagle stood outside the small makeshift chapel they fashioned from scrap wood and tarpaulin, holding a chipped enamel cup of warm tea, watching the camp awaken to another day of struggle, and Grace, a child, tug at his sleeve, smiling, holding up a palm full of pebbles arranged in the shape of a cross. He knelt and smiled back, ruffling the child's hair. "You found the treasure," he said softly. Inside the chapel, a group of volunteers prepared for morning prayers. They had gathered every day since Tagle arrived. Nurses, teachers, cooks, refugees, even skeptics. They didn't come because he asked them. They came because something in them had shifted. It wasn't about sermons or doctrine. It was about the way he listened, the way he sat beside the dying, as if he had nowhere more important to be in a world where most had been made to feel invisible. He had looked each of them in the eye, and they had remembered their worth. As Tagle entered the chapel, the gathered crowd grew silent. There were no pews, no stained glass, no incense, just packed earth beneath their feet, a wooden crucifix nailed to a post, and the flicker of candles in glass jars. He stood at the front, took a breath, and began to read from the Gospel of Matthew. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He didn't elaborate. He didn't preach. He let the words hang in the air like truth finally spoken aloud. When he finished, he folded the Bible gently and looked out at the people before him, mothers holding, sleeping, babies, fathers with weathered hands, children with eyes too old for their age. "This is the church," he said quietly. "Not the buildings, not the titles, not the robes you hear." Now a silence settled that no one dared break for a long moment. They simply breathed together, prayed together, sat in the shared knowledge that something sacred was happening, not in theology, but in presence. And then, without prompting, one by one, people began lighting candles at the base of the crucifix. No one spoke. It wasn't ceremony. It was something older, deeper, a gesture of hope in a world too often absent of it. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in the echoing halls of the Vatican, Pope Leo Orton stepped into his private chapel. The air was heavy with stillness. On his altar lay the photograph of Tagle holding the orphan child, and beside the dried olive branch, now fragile and curled with age. He touched it gently, then placed it inside a small glass case, sealing it not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of what could still bloom later that day. In an unannounced appearance before the General Assembly of Cardinals, Pope Leo spoke briefly, without prepared remarks. He said, "Only this, the heart of the church is not in marble or gold. It is in the dust and the tear in the hand, held in silence. We must go where the heart is, or we will lose it." He said no more, and then he stepped down the room, remained silent long after he had left. Back at the refugee camp, the news of the Pope's unexpected message began to trickle, and a young aid worker ran up to Tagle with a phone, excitement and disbelief on her face. "He spoke about you," she said breathlessly. "He said, the church belongs where you are." Tagle smiled, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out over the camp where children played barefoot in the dirt and women bent over pots of boiling water. Finally, he said, "Then let's not fail her." The days that followed were quiet, but they carried a new kind of hope. Journalists continued to arrive, but Tagle rarely gave interviews. He preferred to speak with his hands, washing wounds, carrying supplies, offering blessings over graves hastily dug under moonlight. He was never too busy for a child's question, never too tired for another hour beside a sick bed. One evening, just before sunset, he gathered a group of volunteers and refugees. Under the largest tent, a thunderstorm loomed in the distance, and wind pulled at the canvas walls, but no one moved to leave Tagle still with a worn Bible in one hand and a small wooden cross in the other. "Some of you have asked if I'll return to Rome," he said. "I will someday, but not to reclaim a seat. I will return when mercy no longer needs to beg for a place at the table." He looked around, his eyes full of gentle defiance. "Until then, I will stay here among the bruised, the abandoned, the ignored, because this," he raised a cross slightly, "is not just a symbol of sacrifice. It is a reminder where love chooses to dwell. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, until it pounded against the roof of the tent like an urgent prayer. But no one left. They sat together as water pulled at their feet, as lightning cracked in the distance, as the thunder rolled overhead, and in that fragile moment, something ancient returned, something that had been missing, not from faith, but from the way faith had been lived. The church, many would say later, had not been changed by an edict or a council or even a pope's declaration. It had been changed by one man's decision to kneel where no one else would. That night, in the dark, quiet heart of the apostolic palace, Pope Leo XIV opened his journal and wrote a single sentence: "The church rises again, not when she commands, but when she weeps." And somewhere far away, in a tent lit only by the flame of one stubborn candle, Cardinal Tagle sat cross-legged in the dirt, reading scripture to a child who didn't understand the words, but felt the warmth of his voice. There were no headlines, no applause, just mercy. And in that mercy, the church breathed again. If today's message moved your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Pope Leo XIV. And faith, join us on a journey of true spiritual awakening and divine insight. What are your thoughts on today's message? Leave a comment below. Your words might be the light someone else desperately needs. This isn't just a video. It's a call back to who we truly are.